All right, let's go over that step one more time, just so you can see a lot closer what I did. So we already had our waistband folded with our interfacing. We had our seam allowance pressed up. And then what I did in that last step was sewing from fold to fold at a 1/2 inch. So I stitched to finish off one side of the waistband, and I left the other side of the waistband open. That's going to be our extension. After I stitched that, I clipped off any extra seam allowance that's going to get in the way of our fold. So what I did was I reached inside of this seam allowance and I cut off this extra fold right here, but not the back seam allowance. And then on the top, I clipped off that corner of our seam allowance. So it looks like this. What I'm gonna do next is flip this waistband inside out, just like that. And you wanna try to get a neat corner on that edge of the waistband. And this edge is going to lay nice and flush with one edge of your center back. So go ahead and flip that inside out and give it a really good press so it looks nice and crisp. So now we're going to move on to attaching the waistband to the skirt body. So you should have your skirt body fully constructed, have your front attached to your sides, 1/2 inch seam allowance pressed open, and then you should also have your back sewn together from your 3-inch notch down to the bottom, and then have that seam allowance pressed open all the way up. Also a reminder that you should have that 1 inch of interfacing on your center back seam allowances. So what you're going to do is take the finished side of your waistband and that seam allowance and line that up with the right side of your skirt. Make sure everything's nice and flush and lined up. You're putting that seam allowance right against the fold of that center back. Now, if you were doing this on a regular skirt application, you would have already sewn in a zipper to this open center back here. And then you would be sewing the waistband on the top of that zipper to finish off the top of the zipper. So you can line this up here and throw some pins in. And you're going to line up these raw edges and pin all the way along this skirt until you reach the other end of your center back. Now when you reach this edge of the center back, with everything all nice and pinned up, you're just going to let this edge of the waistband extend past that center back point. And you're also going to pin that in place, and then we're going to go to the machine and sew from this edge of the center back all the way around to this edge at a 1/2 inch. And you're going to stop at the fold of this center back seam allowance. All right, so just to reiterate what we have going on here, I pinned in the extended seam allowance of my waistband starting at the finished edge. I pinned that onto the folded edge of my center back seam allowance. And then I pinned all the way along the seam allowance and the top of the skirt body until I reached the other back seam allowance of my skirt. Now here I let my waistband extension extend past that folded center back, and then I'm going to stitch in this waistband to the top of the skirt at a 1/2 inch. Now I want the waistband piece to be on top as I'm sewing and the skirt to be on the bottom. So with the sample, I'm gonna start at the extended piece. And I'm gonna start right where the center back ends. You can even put in a little notch at the waistband here, just so you know where you're going to start your stitch. So once you reach the other edge of the center back, you want to be sewing as close as you can to this folded seam allowance piece. So you want to be getting that whole 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure to back tack. So I stitched that whole 1/2 inch and I landed right below the fold of that waistband seam allowance. Stitched all the way to the edge, securing both of those folded edges in there, all the way across. So now we're going to go over to the iron and press this waistband up, and we're going to press this seam allowance up into the waistband. So here we are at the iron. I find it much easier to be ironing this with right sides out. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn the sample just like this. And since we are working with a circular piece of fabric, I find it best to be working with this arm, or even a tailor's hand if you don't have this arm available. So I'm gonna put the waistband sample onto that arm so that we can press this waistband up nice and flat. Now when we get to this finished edge of the waistband, it gets a little bit tricky. So what we want to be doing is pressing this seam allowance up into that finished edge of the waistband. So this is gonna just come right over that seam allowance and cover that up. And this should be laying nice and flush, so you'll have this seam right into the folded edge of that center back. We can go ahead and give that a press. Nice and crisp. So we have this this seam pressed directly up into our waistband. And the next part, we're going to finish off this extension of the waistband. So what we're going to do is turn this seam allowance down, fold the waistband, and open up this 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're looking at it like this. Fold this waistband down, fold down this seam allowance and this seam allowance. So you get raw edges together for the bottom of the extension and then the other edge of the waistband. What we're going to do with the machine is pick up our stitch from this waistband here, stitch over a 1/2 inch, pivot, and come up a 1/2 inch. You can also start at the top of the waistband here, stitch down a 1/2 inch, pivot, and then stitch over another 1/2 inch so that you're landing directly in that seam. So again, we're going to be finishing off this extension of the waistband right here. What we do is fold right sides together of the waistband, press this seam allowance down, press this seam allowance down. Right sides together, seam allowance down, seam allowance down. So we'll have these raw edges lining up and meeting. We can go ahead and pin those pieces together. Just like that. And if it makes it easier, you may draw in your seam allowance, so it'll be a 1/2 inch coming down this way. You'll pivot a 1/2 inch, and you'll pick up those stitches right here. So we're going to start at the top fold of the waistband, back tack, and we're going to come down to this pivot point, which is a 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the waistband, pivot, and then we're going to stitch up until this waistband stitch that we had right here, securing the waistband onto the top of the skirt. Stitch across at a 1/2 inch. Now you may use your wheel to manually bring the stitch right into where you need it to be. Do 1 or 2 stitches as a back tack and pull it out. Alright, so you have that stitch finishing off the second edge of your waistband with the 1 inch extension past the center back. The next step will be to clip off any corners of your seam allowance that will get in the way of turning your waistband inside out. Just like that. We're going to go ahead and turn this waistband extension inside out. Now, one thing that can come in handy for turning this is your tweezers. You can put those inside of this turned extension and sort of push out those corners where you need them. Everything should look nice and crisp and flat and neat. Another way is to use a pin. You can poke into your seam, so like into your stitches, and pull that seam allowance out. Just be careful not to break any of your stitches. So now we're going to go to the iron and press this nice and flat. Alright, so here we are at the iron. We're going to press this waistband nice and flat. We're also going to be pressing the fold of this waistband to cover this stitch, the initial stitch of our waistband. So let's start with the extension. Press that nice and flat. We also want to be pressing the fold of our waistband right here. Okay. Now I'm going to turn this inside out so that we have a better view of that seam allowance right here. We're going to take this fold and bring it down to cover that initial stitch line. And then we'll press the fold line of our waistband at the top. So here we are with the pretty much finished waistband. The next thing that we have to do is to secure the fold of this waistband down onto the skirt body. I'm going to turn this right side out. And here's what we're working with. Now you should be familiar with the stitching in the ditch technique that we've gone over with sample 5, the Hong Kong finish, where you stitch directly into the crease of your seam, just like that, and then you pick up the folded edge of the binding underneath. So you can start by stitching right here, starting right here, and back tack, stitching in the ditch of this waistband seam. And you want to be catching the very edge of the fold of this waistband right here. So you have to make sure that this fold is just beyond that stitch line so that when you stitch in the ditch, you're grabbing the very edge of that fold. Alternatively, you may also hand stitch down this waistband onto the skirt body. You'll start by stitching into the fold here, and then you will use your hand stitches to pick up the skirt body and the waistband, just to secure that all down. Then to finish it off, we'll put a fastening in the extension of the waistband so we can put a snap, a button, a hook and bar, or a hook and eye to make sure that this extension lands nice and flat over the other edge of our waistband. All right, so I'm going to demo stitching in the ditch. So in the light here, you can sort of see that this seam allowance, this fold of the waistband, extends a little bit past the ditch of this initial stitch here. And you can feel that sort of coming beyond. To pin this, you want to put the pin directly into that ditch and then back up into the waistband like that. So on the other side, you can see that where the pin first comes through is at the edge of that fold, and then it goes back into the waistband like that. So you can go ahead and pin along this waistband, making sure that you're catching the very edge of that fold when you pin into the ditch. So I'm going to start right underneath this extension here, and I'm going to use the hand wheel to drop the needle directly into the ditch of that stitch, making sure that I'm grabbing the fold here. Now, if you're stitching accurately inside of that ditch, it should be pretty invisible from the front. Then on the back, you should be catching the very edge of that fold of the waistband. Now, if you're going to be hand stitching this waistband down, you'll be pinning it the same way that you did for the stitching in the ditch. And then we're going to be sewing with a single thread. And you may start from either side, whichever is most comfortable for you. But keep in mind that if you are hand stitching down a waistband, remember that the waistband gets a lot of wear. It has a lot of tension and it moves a lot with the body. So what you want to be doing is making sure that you have a very strong stitch, very neat. You don't want to see it on either side, so we're going to be using a blind stitch. To start off, we're going to start with a knot in the fold of the waistband. Grab just a little bit of the skirt body. Remember, when you grab the skirt body, you don't want to be seeing that stitch on the front side. So remember, the blind stitch hem stays mostly inside of the hem fold for the whole stitch, and then it'll just poke out and grab a bit of the body and go back into the fold. Now the best way to keep this stitch nice and strong is to be doing much smaller stitches than you normally would on a hem. You'll come down, grab the body. Then when you go back into the fold of the waistband, you're only going to stay in there for about a 1/4 inch. And come back out and grab the body. Now, once your waistband is fully secured, the last step will be to add a hem to your skirt. So let's start with the inside out. We're going to start by folding our hem up a 1/4 inch, and then we'll fold it up another 3/4 of an inch, just like that. So once you have that pressed, we want to go in and make sure that the entire hem is consistently the same size. Otherwise, on the outside, you're going to see a wobbly hem. We don't want that. So once you have the hem nice and pressed, twice over, you're going to go in and do any hand stitch hem of your choice. So just like your final garment, you can use any hand hem, but no machine hemming. You may not stitch over this hem on a machine. You have to do a hand stitch. Once that hand stitch is complete, so is your sample. You'll have a nice half-scale waistband.